There are some things you say that you can't take back. Not because they were cruel, exactly, but because they were true in a way you hadn't admitted to yourself yet. That's the kind of thing I said on a Tuesday night in October, standing in my best friend's kitchen, holding a bottle of hot sauce and trying to be funny. I wish I could tell you I was drunk. I wasn't. I was just 24 years old and careless in the way that only 24-year-olds can be. The kind of careless that doesn't feel like anything until it turns into the most important moment of your life. My name is Colton, and before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you've ever said something you couldn't unsay, something that cracked the ceiling of your ordinary life and let in a light you weren't ready for, write the word truth in the comments below. Because this story is for you. Before I tell you what I said that night, let me tell you about the life I had built up to that point. Because the context matters more than you'd think. I grew up in a mid-sized town in western Ohio, the kind of place where everyone graduated high school knowing everyone else's business, and half of them stayed and half of them left. I stayed, at least for a few years after school, working at a distribution warehouse on the edge of town, while I tried to figure out what I actually wanted to do. I took a few community college courses, dropped one, finished two, and generally moved through my early 20s in the slow, uncertain way that nobody warns you about when you're 17 and convinced life has a clear path waiting for you. My best friend was a guy named Derek Paulson. We'd been close since 8th grade, bonded first over a shared hatred of PE class, and then over just about everything else. Music, bads in movies, the particular comfort of not having to explain yourself to someone. Derek was one of those people who made every room feel slightly more manageable. He had this easy laugh and the kind of loyalty that you don't fully appreciate until you've had to test it. Derek lived with his mother in a house on Clover Mill Road, about 12 minutes from my apartment. His dad had been out of the picture since Derek was 9, not dramatically gone, just gradually gone, the slow fade of a man who couldn't figure out how to stay. So it had been Derek and his mom for a long time. Her name was Suzanne Paulson. She was 46 when this story starts. A physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic 2 towns over. She was the kind of woman who made everything look slightly more effortless than it probably was. Not because she was pretending, but because she had spent so many years learning how to carry weight without letting it show. I had known Suzanne for over a decade by the time any of this happened. She was Derek's mom. That was the whole frame I'd ever put around her. She made good chili. She asked thoughtful follow-up questions. When you told her something was wrong, she watched documentaries on Friday nights and kept a small herb garden on the kitchen windowsill. She was a presence in my life the way background music is a presence, always there, always real, never quite in focus. Until that Tuesday in October, Derek and I had spent the evening doing absolutely nothing productive. We'd watched the first half of a game, made tacos that didn't quite come together, and were now standing in the kitchen, arguing amiably about whether a specific road trip we'd taken 3 years ago had gone through Indiana or Illinois, a debate that had no stakes and no resolution. At some point, Suzanne came home from a late shift, still in her work clothes, her dark hair pulled back, moving through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done 1,000 long days before this one, and would do 1,000 more. She said hello, asked how the tacos were, and reached past me to get a glass from the cabinet, and I, without pausing, without filtering, without applying any of the social awareness I theoretically possessed, said something that stopped the room. I said that the women Derek had introduced me to over the years were all great, but honestly, his mom was more attractive than most of them. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek looked at me like I had just suggested we burn the house down for fun. His expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that landed somewhere near mortification. I could feel my face doing the thing faces do when the brain finally catches up to the mouth, that slow dawning flush of complete and total, "What did I just say?" I laughed. The awkward, retreating kind of laugh you use when you're hoping to reclassify a disaster as a joke. But Suzanne didn't walk away. She set her glass on the counter, turned around, and looked at me with an expression I genuinely did not know how to read. It wasn't embarrassed. It wasn't annoyed. It was something quieter and stranger than either of those things. Curious, maybe, measuring. She said, "That's a surprising thing to say, Colton. I said I was just messing around, that it came out wrong, that I didn't mean anything by it." She nodded, slowly. Then she said, "Most things people claim they didn't mean are the things they mean the most." She picked up her glass and walked down the hallway toward her room, The door didn't close loudly. It just closed. Derek and I stood there in a kitchen that felt like it had changed dimensions. He didn't say anything to me for about 10 minutes. Then he said, very quietly, that I should probably go home. I did. I drove back to my apartment with the radio off, which almost never happened, because silence in a car had a way of forcing thoughts forward that I usually preferred to push back. What was I actually thinking when I said that? Was I thinking anything? Or was it one of those moments where something true just finds a crack in the surface and comes out sideways? I told myself it was the second thing. It was easier. But I kept thinking about the look on Suzanne's face. Not offended, not flattered, just reading me. Like she was checking whether I was worth the bother of responding to honestly. The next few weeks were strange. Derek and I still hung out, but there was a thin new tension in the air, like a wire someone had strung across a room you used to walk through easily. He never brought up what I'd said. I never brought it up. We both pretended the kitchen moment hadn't happened, which is to say we both thought about it constantly. I started going to Derek's house less, not because anyone asked me to, but because I didn't know how to be in that space the same way anymore. When I did go, I was careful in a way I'd never been careful before. Careful about where I sat, what I said, how I moved through the rooms. Suzanne was largely absent during those visits. Or maybe she wasn't absent. Maybe I was just hyper-aware of every moment she was or wasn't in the room. Then something happened that I didn't plan and couldn't have engineered. Derek's car broke down on a Wednesday afternoon. Something with the alternator, and he needed me to give him a ride to pick up a part from the auto parts store. I showed up at the house, and Derek wasn't back yet from wherever he'd walked, but Suzanne was home early, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of paperwork from the clinic. She looked up when I knocked on the door. She said Derek had texted that he was 5 minutes away. She told me to come in. I sat down at the kitchen table across from her. She kept working through her papers for a moment, and then she set her pen down and looked at me with the same level quality she'd had the night in October. She said she'd been thinking about what I said. I told her again that I hadn't meant anything by it. She said she knew that's what I'd told myself. Then she asked me a question that I was not prepared for. She asked if I had ever actually talked to her. Not in the room-to-room way of a friend's son visiting, actually talked to her, like she was a person. I didn't have a good answer, because the honest answer was no. She didn't say it unkindly. She just said it. And then she went back to her paperwork. And when Derek got back, we went to the auto parts store, and the afternoon went on the way afternoons do. But something had shifted, and this time I didn't try to pretend it hadn't. After that Wednesday, I started noticing things I'd been too inattentive to notice before. Suzanne came home most days looking tired in a specific way. Not from lack of sleep, but from giving. Physical therapy, I learned, was more emotionally demanding than I'd ever imagined. You spent your days working with people in pain, encouraging them, holding steady while they struggled, and then you drove home and tried to locate yourself again. She had done this for nearly 15 years. She'd given up a graduate program in health administration when Derek was born. Not resentfully, she told me later, but it was still something set down that never got picked back up. She had close friends but saw them rarely. She liked to cook but usually only made real meals on weekends. She'd thought, when Derek turned 18, that her life might open back up into something more spacious. But then Derek's 20s started, and she realized she'd forgotten how to think about herself the way she'd thought about herself before. I learned all of this slowly, not in one conversation, but in 10, 15, 20 conversations stretched over 3 months. Some of them were 5 minutes long, me stopping by to grab Derek and ending up on the porch for a while. Some were longer, when Derek fell asleep on the couch, and Suzanne and I ended up talking at the kitchen table until it was past 11, and I had to work in the morning. I won't say I fell in love with her in those conversations, because I'm not sure falling is the right word for what happened. It was more like I became unable to stop seeing her. The way certain things once noticed can't go unnoticed. The way she described her patients with so much care and so little sentimentality. The way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her. This quick, unguarded sound, like she'd forgotten to be composed. The way she talked about Derek with a combination of exasperation and fierce, unstated pride that made me understand what it actually meant to love someone without condition. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I tried other explanations. Maybe I just had more respect for her than I'd ever registered before. Maybe it was gratitude or loneliness or some strange transference from a life that felt a little stuck. I ran through every alternative and kept arriving at the same door. I was 32 years old by this point, 8 years older than I'd been, when Derek and I first became friends, 6 years into a working life that had shifted from the warehouse to a floor supervisor position at a regional supply company, a life that was stable and fine and missing something I couldn't name until I could. One evening in February, Derek was away for a long weekend visiting a college friend in Pittsburgh. I hadn't known Suzanne would be home alone. I knocked on the door with a book she'd mentioned wanting to borrow. She'd been talking about it weeks ago, and I'd bought 2 copies by accident, or told myself it was by accident. She opened the door and looked at the book and then at me for a long moment. She said, "Derek's not here this weekend." I said I knew. She stepped back and let me in. We sat in the living room for 4 hours that night. We talked about her childhood in North Carolina, about a summer she'd spent working at a state park at 19 that she still thought about. I talked about the years I'd spent certain I was going to leave Ohio and then certain I wasn't, and how I'd made peace with that in my late 20s in a way I hadn't expected to. At some point she made tea, and the lamp on the side table was the only light on, and the evening had that specific quality that evenings sometimes have, where the outside world recedes so completely that the room you're in becomes the only real place. She said she needed to be honest with me about something. She said she was aware of what had been happening, the gradual shift in our conversations, the way certain moments had taken on a weight that neither of us was acknowledging. She said she was not going to pretend she hadn't noticed it, or that she hadn't, in some quiet part of herself, let herself wonder. Then she said, "But I need you to think about what this would mean for Derek, for me, for you." She wasn't pushing me away. She was being precise. That was one of the things I had come to understand about her. She was almost constitutionally incapable of being imprecise about important things. I told her I had been thinking about it, almost exclusively. She said that wasn't the same as knowing what to do. She was right. I drove home and lay in bed for 2 hours before I admitted to myself that the only right next step was the hardest. 3 days later, I asked Derek if we could talk. In person, just the 2 of us. He said yes, and we met at a bar we'd been going to for years. A quiet place on 4th Street with wood paneling and decent beer and a back corner booth where nobody bothered you. I told him everything. Not everything. I was careful to be honest about where things actually stood, which was not as far along as it might have been without Suzanne's insistence on precision. But I told him that I had developed feelings for his mother, that I hadn't planned it and hadn't wanted it, and had tried to talk myself out of it thoroughly and failed. I told him that his friendship mattered to me more than I knew how to explain, and that I was telling him before anything happened, because the alternative was something I couldn't make myself do. Derek said nothing for a long time. He looked at his beer. He turned the glass a quarter turn and then turned it back. He said he needed me to leave. I left. The weeks that followed were among the hardest I've had. Derek went quiet in the complete way. No texts, no calls, no passive activity on social media that would have told me he was at least still in the universe. The bar on 4th Street stopped feeling like mine. My apartment felt too small for the amount of thinking I was doing in it. Suzanne and I didn't speak either. She had asked me to give Derek time, and I owed her that, and I owed him that, and I honored it even when honoring it felt like holding still in a current. About 8 weeks after the bar, I got a text from Derek. It said, "Can we talk?" We met for coffee this time. He looked like someone who had been through a long internal weather event. He said he'd spent 2 months being furious at me, and furious at himself for not having noticed what was happening under his nose, and furious at the situation for being a situation. He said he'd also spent that time watching his mother. He said she seemed lighter, like something she'd been carrying had been partially set down. Not because of me specifically, he clarified, but because someone had actually seen her. Not as his mom, not as the person visiting the house, as herself. He said he didn't know how he felt about it and probably wouldn't for a while. He said that if I hurt her, our friendship was over and he would not be moved on that point. He said it without anger, which made it land harder than anger would have. Then he said, "She deserves someone who sees her." I said I did see her. He nodded once slowly. He picked up his coffee and looked at the window. He said, "I know you do." Suzanne and I went on our first official date in April to a restaurant in Columbus that she had been wanting to try for 2 years and never had. We were there for 3.5 hours. We talked about everything from the logistics of her herb garden to a trip to Portugal she had half planned and abandoned in 2019, And she was funny in a way I'd always registered, but never fully heard before. Sharp and dry, and with this quick pivot wit that caught you sideways. I drove home thinking that the world had a strange and serious generosity to it, if you were paying attention. There's something I want to say before I finish this story, and it's not the thing that sounds easiest. It's just true. The path from that October kitchen to where I'm standing now wasn't graceful. There were dinners where Derek was polite in the careful way that meant he was working hard at it. There were holidays where the three of us sat in rooms with a history that hadn't fully settled yet. There were moments when I wondered whether I had taken something from Derek that I had no right to take, even as I understood that what I'd found hadn't been taken from anyone. But time is patient with the things that are real. Slowly, the politeness became ease again, and the ease became something that resembled what Derek and I had always been. Rougher around the edges now, more honestly grounded. But there, Suzanne and I got engaged 2 years ago in a completely non-dramatic fashion. We were at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd set down her pen and asked me if I'd ever actually talked to her. And she said she'd been thinking about things, and I said I'd been thinking about the same things, and she said so, and I said so. And that was the whole conversation, more or less. We got rings the following weekend. Derek was at the engagement dinner. He made a toast that was 1/3 sincere and 2/3 devastating jokes at my expense, which told me everything was going to be fine. The other night, the three of us were sitting in the living room after dinner, the same living room where Derek once looked at me like I'd lost my mind. And Derek brought up the October incident. He brings it up occasionally, with increasing levels of theatrical disbelief, and Suzanne and I let him have that because he's earned it. He said he still couldn't believe I'd said what I said, in this house, at that moment, holding a bottle of hot sauce. Suzanne laughed, the quick, unguarded one, and said that sometimes the most honest things we ever say come out sideways. She looked at me when she said it, and I thought about all the things that had to go exactly right and exactly wrong in order for us to end up in this room, and how none of it followed the plan I'd had for my life, and how that turned out to be the best possible thing about all of it. Some lines, once you cross them, don't go back. Not because they were mistakes, but because they were underneath all the noise and the awkwardness and the fear, the most honest thing you'd ever said.